Hello and welcome to this episode of Sharp Scratch. This is a podcast brought to you by the BMJ, where medical students, resident doctors and expert guests come together and discuss all the things you need to know to be a good doctor, but that you might not get taught at medical school. My name's George. I'm a final year medical student at the University of Warwick. However, over the past year, I've been working at the BMJ as editorial scholar, looking after all of the content that BMJ student has produced. Today we are joined by two panellists. We have Anna and Elgan. Would you both like to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, sure thing. So my name's Anna. I am a junior obstetrics and gynecology doctor in Newcastle, but I'm currently on maternity leave, so obviously got lots of time for doing fun stuff like interesting podcasts. And I also used to do the job that George is currently doing, so I'm a former editorial scholar at the BMJ.
And I'm Elgan. I'm going to soon be starting 5th year of medicine at Edinburgh University, and I'm a BMJ Clegg Scholar, so I'm spending a bit of my summer with the BMJ between medicine.
Thank you so much. I'd also like to welcome our expert guest today, Paul Garrud. Could you tell us a bit about yourself, please?
I chair the Medical Schools Council Selection Alliance. We've been going just over 10 years now, and that brings together all the admissions leads for all the UK medical schools. And I'm an honorary associate professor at the University of Nottingham, where for a period of time I was in charge of admissions for graduate entry medicine there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to have everybody with us today. Preparing for medical school interviews can often be a daunting prospect for those applying for medicine. So what's the best way to do this? In today's episode of Sharp Scratch, we're going to have a chat about the things that medical schools are looking for when interviewing, how you can best prepare for interviews, as well as how to cope with pre-interview anxiety. So, Paul, I think my first question really is for you, but there are different types of interviews depending on which medical school you're applying to.
I suppose in 2025, we probably encounter about 3 different kinds. And there are a number of similarities between them, of course. One, and the most widespread, is the so-called multiple mini interview. A little bit like speed dating. It's it might be anything from 5 to 10 short, separate interviews with separate interviewers, and you rotate through so that you see each different interviewer, and each different interviewer will pose you different questions or a different task to do. So that's why it's called the multiple, and that's also why it's called the mini interview, because each individual one lasts perhaps only 5 minutes or so. Then there's the more traditional kind of panel interview, where you might be interviewed by 2 or possibly 3 different interviewers for anything from 20 to 30, maybe slightly more minutes, and they'll ask a whole series of questions for you to respond to, and then make their judgments. The pandemic in 2020, and obviously it ran on into 2021, pushed most medical schools into interviewing virtually, doing them online. And those were often panel interviews, but some medical schools used multiple mini interviews. But another innovation that came in at that time was the asynchronous online interview. So something in which you had the opportunity to record your responses to a series of interview questions, but instead of it being in real time with an interviewer there listening and perhaps responding or asking you some follow-up questions, it was simply recording your responses to questions, and the interviewers would view that recording at a later stage and so on, and score it, and see what evidence it provided. And there are still some schools who are using this kind of asynchronous virtual kind of interview now. So those are the 3 kinds that you're likely to encounter at present in the UK.
Anna and Elgan, what were your experiences like with your kind of med school interviews?
I was in the middle of COVID with mine, so I had all of mine online, similar to what Paul described. Some of them were almost multiple minute interviews because they sort of did 4 or 5 short and snappy ones, I suppose. No fully traditional MMI interview for me.
Well, this is going back into the mists of time now, because I realised it was 10 years ago that I did some of these applications and interviews. And I actually did traditional interviews. So I went to King's College London, and that's where I studied medicine. And I think it was actually the last year that they were still doing the traditional panel interviews at King's, and they've switched over to an MMI format now. And I also interviewed at Barts in the London, which was a traditional interview but in a slightly different format. I did also have 2 offers for interviews for multiple mini interviews at Hull York, and also at St George's, but I didn't end up going to those because I had already done my interviews.
So I did MMIs to get into Warwick. Warwick was the only place that I did interviews at. And I actually did them right before COVID. So they were the last kind of in-person MMIs for a couple of years when I did them. And I honestly, I'm not sure that I can remember much about the day. I do remember being nervous, kind of going in and having a day of interviews, but I can't remember that much really about them. But Paul, if people are listening to this, and they're probably listening to this because they're thinking about preparing for interviews, or they're given an interview and they're going to be preparing for them, do you think you need to prepare in different ways depending on the type of interview?
Not really. That is to say, being familiar with the format so that you're expecting whatever actually you encounter in terms of, for example, moving around, having a longer interview with many people, or having many separate interviews with probably 1 or only 2 people in each. Yes, be prepared so you know what's coming. But other than that, no, I think the kind of preparation is pretty much the same.
I spent a lot of time trying to be very, very prepared for very specific types of questions or for very specific scenarios. And I spent a long time almost going towards the state of preparing specific answers for things, or preparing exactly what I was going to say, or envisaging a role play scenario that might come up, or something very difficult. And I think I got lost down a bit of a sort of rabbit hole there. I definitely think one of my core bits of advice for sort of preparing for interviews, because it's the first big interview probably that you do in a medical career, but it's the first of many. You might do them during med school, you definitely do them later in your career. And I guess what I think I've learned from those experiences and then later experiences is just preparing in broad brushstrokes is often more helpful. And so preparing some thoughts about ethical questions you might get, or questions about why you were motivated to do medicine, or the experiences you've had in doing work experience or volunteering, but keeping it really broad and not stressing about exactly the phrasing of the question they're going to ask you.
Yeah, definitely. I think when I think back to my experience, I went to a very small school, and there really wasn't very many. Not many people from that school went to medical school, so I think they were all a bit baffled about how they could. My teachers were brilliant; like they really wanted to help me. And the head teacher was like, "Right, come to my office, and we're going to do a mock interview." But I mean, he hadn't done medicine. I don't know if he knew anyone who had, I think he did English. And he asked me all these questions, and I remember sitting there and being like, I don't know. I don't know. And he was really, really probing. And I think he was trying to give me an experience that when I got to the interviews, it wouldn't be the first time I'd maybe experienced those kind of additional like probing questions and things like that. But I do remember coming out of that and thinking, oh, I have got absolutely no chance if that's what these interviews are going to be like. So in some ways, it was actually quite good, because when I turned up at the interviews and it wasn't as bad as that, it was less of a baptism of fire, coming from a slightly smaller school and like not knowing really anyone who had been to medical school before. But I think on the topic of preparation, I think one thing I would say is, particularly if you have any additional needs, or you would appreciate sort of a bit more of a walkthrough of the setting, or exactly where you need to go on the day, then do get in touch, I think, with the medical schools individually, because I do remember when I went to my interview at Barts, it was a panel interview, but they were all going on in the same room. So they had a big hall set up. And that's usually how it will be with like a multiple mini interview as well, if you're doing one in person. And I found it very difficult with that level of background noise to focus on what was happening in the interview. So I think, say if you had problems with your hearing, like that could be very difficult for you. So I think being open and investigating those things sort of beforehand can be really, really useful. But yeah, I definitely agree with what Elgan was saying about, the broad brushstrokes, and that's something I've taken through to interviews later on in my career as well. I think something I always really struggled with was sort of knowing when to end an answer. So something I found really useful was preparing a final phrase. And that might be something that I did have in my mind. This is the last thing I'm going to say, and then I'm going to be quiet.
I could see you laughing, Paul. I want to know your thoughts.
Well, I was just going to firstly confirm something Anna said, that if you might want or benefit from some reasonable adjustments, medical schools are very familiar with doing this. So as long as you get in touch with them beforehand, they can usually make most arrangements for people. No, I had never thought of preparing a final phrase, Anna. That's a very useful thing. And if I ever have to go through interviews again, I will deploy that.
So I'm doing graduate entry, so I didn't have the experience of like being at school while I was thinking about applying for medicine. So I was like working, and I'd done interviews for jobs in the past, and I'd done quite intense interviews for jobs in the past, but I hadn't done an interview to get into my first degree or for my I'm fairly certain I didn't have to do an interview to get into my master's that I did. So I felt like very much on my own, and I didn't really know anyone who was a medic who I could have a chat with. And I think even if I did, if they'd gone to medical school like quite a few years before me, I'm not sure how helpful that would have been. So I don't know whether it was like for you, like a good thing, like having an experience where your school were kind of invested in giving you an experience, even if that wasn't like an authentic experience of what a medical school interview was like. So
You raise a good point, though, George, because where do people get advice from? And I guess, the commonest and easiest places to get advice are your friends and your family, or perhaps, family friends, particularly maybe if they are working in the health professions. And there are risks of all of those things, even though, they're very friendly and they're very helpful and they're very well motivated towards you. It's quite likely that none of them have actually had experience recently of what a medicine interview comprises. So I think one of the things I'd suggest to people is do go and try and get some advice from somebody who's in a position to actually know what's happening, currently. So that can be, for example, in most medical schools, there are student societies running, and they very often run interview preparation days or interview preparation sessions. So even looking for the student society in your nearest medical school can be quite useful. They have at least A, been through it recently, and B, will know what's going on in their medical school. Then Medical Schools Council runs a preparing for the medical school interview site. That's another perfectly reasonable one. Many medical schools actually give quite detailed advice on exactly how they're going to run their interviews. So preparing, by actually making sure that you know what you're going to encounter, I think is also a useful thing to do.
There are a lot of free resources, definitely, that I think are accessible. Definitely online ones. Things like the Medic portal was really helpful for me, and that's been free for a long time. And I think it's also worth emphasising that you can access the things you need to access to prepare for an interview for free. There's some great initiatives like Intermed School as well, which is across the entirety of the UK and offers you opportunity to contact and sort of be mentored by a medical student in the UK, particularly for interviews as well. And there's definitely a lot of ways you could, for example, spend quite a lot of money trying to prepare for interviews, which is not something that's really necessary. What is really helpful and definitely helped me, I suppose, something that I've seen students struggle with when they're trying to prepare for an interview, and I've sort of helped people who are looking to get into medicine, is understanding exactly what they're looking for. I think once you understand that, the whole pathway becomes a lot clearer. I wonder, Paul, it's a few years ago since I actually sat an interview. What would you say is like, what are you looking for if you were doing an interview, or what are interviewers in sort of essence looking for when they interview somebody?
Yeah, I think, Elgan, you asked the fundamental question. Why do we have interviews? What's the function? What's the purpose? And the answer is it's to look for or try and, test or get evidence about those kind of personal attributes and personal values the things that you don't show up in doing well in school exams or in doing the admissions tests that every medical school now uses. The UCAT, I guess, is the most common one, or in graduate entry, sometimes it's the GAMSAT test. And those are all tests really of kind of cognitive ability and intellectual attainment, if you like. So the purpose of interviews is to look for the other things that we think are really important to be effective doctors. So, the typical things that interviewers are looking for are behaviors and values that align with what's expected of a medical professional, of a doctor. So, core values of the NHS, respect and dignity, behaviors like good communication, empathy, problem solving, moral reasoning, teamwork, understanding what's involved in training and then working as a doctor, what you've learnt about yourself and about other people from any voluntary or paid work experience. And that might be on the checkout of a fast food outlet or a supermarket, or it might be in more of a caring role, and so on. But the thing about those situations is that you're going to encounter people you don't necessarily have a lot in common with, and you'll find out stuff about yourself, the things that you feel comfortable and that actually you're quite good at doing, and the things that you actually feel really uncomfortable. And you realize, hang on, I don't quite know what I'm doing. I need to work out how to deal with this sort of situation in future.
And Paul, so you've kind of touched on the things that, medical schools might be looking for when they're interviewing prospective students. Have you come across kind of misconceptions about what medical schools are looking for when they're interviewing people?
Occasionally, people seem to think that there is kind of one key attribute that might make them stand out from everybody else, and they view themselves as being in competition with. So some particular kind of extracurricular experience or role, for example, or that they put a great deal of effort into coming over in some particular way. It might be very formal appearance, or having an awful lot to say about some current issue in research, or a more political issue about the health service. And sometimes people come in with sort of very rehearsed, I think, things to say. And it shows up very obviously, because they will try and fit it in, no matter what you actually ask them as an interviewer, and so on. You won't get a response to what you asked. You'll get something else that's kind of worked in. It's a bit like, our national politicians sometimes when they're being interviewed on the radio and television, that they avoid us answering the difficult questions sometimes, and get on to saying what they want to get over instead.
I think it's easy to think that you're the biggest and the best thing you could possibly say in an interview is the fact that you spent a week shadowing a doctor in a hospital. And at least in my understanding, it's really not. The strength of the answer, or the strength of how you interview, is from you being able to take whatever experience you have, whatever experience that is, if it's a checkout counter experience, as Paul just said, and then being able to do this thing which we keep doing throughout med school and beyond, which is reflecting on what you've done, which it's sort of a bit of a buzzword, and it's quite hard to get your head around what you're trying to do when you reflect on something. But with a bit of practice, you can look at pretty much any experience you had, however medical it was, in your preparation for your interview or when you're thinking about medicine, and you can quickly, briefly summarize what you did, and then spend the bulk of your time in an interview answer or in a conversation with an interviewer, focusing on what you learned from it, what was difficult about it, what you didn't enjoy about it, what you loved about it, and then perhaps coming to a conclusion at the end that it taught you something.
The medical schools, as you say, George, from a widening access, widening participation point of view, I do think medical schools are aware that it is possibly increasingly difficult sort of post-COVID to get work experience in a hospital, and that probably, I hope this isn't a controversial thing to say, probably the vast majority of people who have done work experience in a hospital is probably through personal contacts, e.g. like family members being doctors and stuff, which is not to say that that's not useful experience. But I think that the medical schools are aware that that's not something that is sort of universally available. So I totally echo what Elgan was saying regarding, thinking about what you've learned from the experiences that you have had, and not just, people don't want to hear a list of things that you've done, because that doesn't really mean anything. Before you start trying to convince interview panels that you're going to be a good doctor, you've got to convince yourself that you're going to be a good doctor, right? So you need to know what your reasons are. And the only way that you're going to be able to do that is if you have had certain experiences that have meant something to you or have changed you, and you're able to talk about that. Then I think that is sort of the main thing. And I do a lot of reviewing, or have done in the past, a lot of reviewing of personal statements, and that's the biggest bit of advice that I give to people as well, is that this is not a dispassionate list of things that you've done. That doesn't really say anything about who you are. Although I hear that they're going to get rid of personal statements, which is quite sad, because I really kind of enjoyed writing mine all those years ago. But I suppose I do appreciate that the role of AI that's come in. I was thinking about this earlier on today, because I actually went to a very interesting presentation at the Association for the Study of Medical Education conference last year about how people can possibly use AI during interviews to answer questions. But I just thought, who is going to go to all that effort? But I don't know, maybe people are. I don't know, Paul, is this something that is a big problem, and your committee talks about?
It is something that's regarded as a bit of a current issue, certainly, Anna. Fortunately, the AI engines readily available are still not very good. But it certainly has been a strong reason pushing most medical schools against continuing with online or virtual interviews back to face-to-face in-person interviews. Certainly for home students, I guess, when you've got international students applying from many countries across the world, it's often impractical for them to come to the UK for every interview. So virtual interviews are probably going to carry on with their. There is some research going on at the moment into AI assistance in interviews.
I actually really valued that experience because I'd not been to any of the medical schools. So this was my opportunity to go and have a look and see whether, that was somewhere that you're going to be there maybe for 6-7 years. I think we were discussing this earlier in the group chat, weren't we, George, about how it's just as much an opportunity for you to see what the sort of vibe of that medical school is, whether that's somewhere that you want to spend your time, as it is for them to think about you and whether you're a good fit for their course as well. And I remember a lot of the advice that I got was around the specific medical schools and thinking about why specifically you had chosen those medical schools. And I mean, for me, it was because I was from Margate and there wasn't a medical school in Kent, so I chose all the South London ones because I wanted to be close to my home, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to say. But, having a few other things up your sleeve, like I was quite interested at the time in anatomy. So I chose medical schools where we still did full body dissection. And that was something I really valued as part of my early medical school experience. So that was something I spoke about in my interview at King's, was that, as why I'd chosen King's.
And I do agree as well. I think it is an opportunity for you to understand what the med school's like. I suppose a lot of, applicants or a lot of people about to go to an interview are so stressed about the experience that they don't really take the opportunity to get much themselves out of it. And if you frame it around what you're going to gain as well, it might relax you a little bit and actually probably make you do a little bit better as an interviewee as well. One thing as well, George, you asked about misconceptions or sort of myths. I think one that I've experienced has been an expectation that you need to have medical or clinical knowledge. Even a little bit, don't think people are thinking they need to be a medical student, but people are thinking about biology and chemistry and human medical knowledge, and they're sometimes getting down a bit of a rabbit hole.
And Paul, I'll say in the group chat where we had a little chat about this earlier, somebody said that they remember when they were preparing for their interviews, somebody at their sixth one was trying to learn how to interpret an X-ray because they were worried they might have to interpret an X-ray in their interview, which I was really,
I mean, what kind of X-ray? I can't do that now. Not my area. It's not my area.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, when people start putting together sets of questions for interviews, there are a number of kind of things to test it against, and one is this going to disadvantage some applicants, some candidates at the interview, and therefore anything that really assume some kind of technical or detailed knowledge, medical knowledge, and so on, is pretty much going to get ruled out on that basis. That it'll actually discriminate, perhaps in favour of the odd one, but against the majority of applicants. So, no, that's a real misconception.
And can I ask Paul, because I think one of the other things I've come across, especially when I speak to people now who are wanting to apply for medicine, they always ask, are the paid interview courses something that I should be doing? They're not accessible for a lot of students who want to apply for medicine. And I think people are worried that they will be at a disadvantage if they haven't paid for an interview course.
Yes, I can appreciate that. And because there is a fair degree of competition for places at medical school and so on, we do have a flourishing commercial sector offering all sorts of, products and promises. And I guess my personal contribution and endeavor over the last just over a decade now has been all in the direction of trying to make sure that we're providing advice and guidance and resources to people as widely as possible that are pro bono, that are free and easily accessible. I do think there is an advantage in a bit of practice before you go to an interview, but paying to go on a course to practice and know what's coming, it's not necessary. Find a trusted friend, a trusted teacher if you're at school, possibly a work colleague if you're out in the world of work, and so on, and practice them asking you some interview questions. Now, Anna gave the example earlier on of her was it your head teacher who had an English degree and didn't necessarily know anything about medicine. So I would cobble together, a few questions from medical school websites, or I think the Medical Schools Council preparing for interview has examples of questions and videos of questions. So I'd kind of pull together some genuine questions that have been used and so on, and get your friend or your colleague or your teacher to use those as a basis for the sort of things that you might get asked, and give you a chance to respond to something, because responding on the spot, the timing, because you may have only 5 minutes to respond to an individual question in a multiple mini interview situation, and then having somebody who can give you some positive and constructive feedback.
Something which people I've helped have often tried to avoid is sort of what Paul was saying, is practicing, but also it's okay and it's worth making that practice quite formal quite early on. I definitely try and procrastinate doing the scariest bit of preparing for an interview, which is practicing a really formalized interview with a friend or something like that. But actually doing that, 4 or 5 weeks before the interview rather than a couple of days beforehand because you tried to avoid it is pretty useful.
And we talked about reflection earlier on, and I think going through the experience and thinking, why is it that we're reluctant to expose ourselves to those sorts of situations? And it is for fear of showing ourselves up, isn't it? For our trusted friend or colleague and so on, that they might laugh at us and what we say. But actually, that tells us something about ourselves, and being able to just, catch yourself and think, why did I put that off? Why am I so chary about this? Is actually quite a useful exercise in itself.
And I think that's so useful for being a medic generally, because there's so many situations where you have to put yourself in you have to kind of force yourself to feel a little bit uncomfortable, whether that's like preparing for OSCEs or doing simulations. So I think the faster you get over that discomfort of like being a bit embarrassed, preparing with friends, the better, because it's probably something that will benefit you in the long run, getting comfortable with. I mean, I've had to record some of my consultations in my last year at medical school, and like watching those back at
Oh,
first is horrendous.
excruciating.
And also your group watching it back and then giving their feedback is, yeah, excruciating. So I do think like sitting with that discomfort and getting used to discomfort like that is probably a really good thing to expose yourself to quite early on.
There's a whole school of thought around the performance of medicine and how we perform our roles as doctors, and it's something that I've always been really I'm anyone who's listened to me on this podcast before will know that I'm obsessed with identity. So that performing aspect of it I find really fascinating, and I think something that would be a big tip from me, which kind of plays into that, is that no matter if I'm at home, because I've done interviews at home as well for my academic jobs, both my academic foundation and my ACF that I'm doing now were both online interviews, and I knew exactly what the questions were going to be, particularly for my academic clinical fellowship, because it's run by the NIHR, and as part of their widening access initiatives, they tell you what the questions are. I knew exactly what the questions were, so you could memorize something and recite something. I didn't take that approach because I didn't feel that would be the best way to respond to those questions. But anyway, back to my point. I always wore what I would have worn to an interview if I was going in person. So full suit, matching socks, I put shoes on, even though I was still inside, because that just put me into the mindset of, okay, now we're going to focus on this. I'm going to be my best professional self. But that doesn't mean that you have to be completely serious. And I remember laughing in my interview at King's. We had a laugh, the three of us. And I mean, it was quite obvious that it was getting towards the end of the day, and these two interviewers were looking a bit bedraggled and tired, and they probably just thought, gosh, we just want to, have an easy one that's an easy yes or an easy no. So I think that, that's important to remember as well. They might be looking down and making notes and things like that, and that's not a comment about you and the way you're coming across. It's just that they probably have seen so many people. I've done marking for OSCEs before, and by the time you sort of get to the fifth person, you think, wait, was it this person that did that, or was it the last one? I can't remember. So don't get put off if they're not always sort of interacting with you, if they're sort of making notes, or you think that they're doing ticks or crosses and you're desperately trying to see, is that a tick or is that a cross? That's it's not anything to do with you.
Going on from what we've been talking about, one of the things that I think people might struggle with is managing nerves and anxiety. Somebody that I interviewed with when I did my interviews said to me after he got into medical school and we were both there, and it was like probably a couple of years in, he said, we met on the day of our interview, and I was so sick that day. I was so nervous. I spent most of the day vomiting in the bathroom. And I thought, well, the fact that, we put that much pressure on the situation, Paul, what can we do? What can students do to not let themselves get that nervous?
It does happen. There's a general recognition that most people find interviews quite demanding and fairly stressful. So one of the things that, for example, I often used in Nottingham as a kind of guide to my interviewers was, expect a degree of, nervousness amongst your interviewers and so on, but only take it seriously if it's to such an extent, they're anxious to such an extent that it's really disruptive. And most interviews, in my experience, are actually pretty good at trying to settle people's nerves, calm them down, give them time to recover themselves. Sometimes actually giving some practical advice, like, just stop, take a breath, just take a moment, have a bit more time, take some deep breaths, hydration, carrying a drink, a bottle of water around with you, or often in interviews they actually have glasses of water present, because after all, you're going to be doing most of the talking while you're doing an interview. So those things are all to say, Look, being anxious is actually quite a common experience. It is expected, and people do not mark you down just because you're anxious and a bit stressed over the whole thing. I think some of it is preparation, trying to make sure you get there reasonably early so you're not stressed, as Anna just described. Actually, make sure you have a meal before you come. Make sure that you've got a bottle of water with you, so you're hydrated. And then don't feel that there's something wrong with taking time to read any materials that you're given carefully and taking time to actually think before you respond. Or if you're in the middle of a response, just saying, okay, I'm just going to stop for a moment and just see if there's something else I want to add to that. Because there is usually plenty of time to allow for some pauses to think.
Yeah, absolutely. And Anna and Elgan, were you really anxious?
Yes, I was very anxious before all of my interviews. I think in terms of my advice for people who are sort of imminently going to set an interview, I'd say it's maybe just to get the basics right. I think Paul sort of described a few of them there, but if you get yourself in a knot, if you're trying, for example, to have rehearsed answers and you're trying to think about them the night before or the morning of, you've got them written down or silly things like that, and you'll get yourself in a twist as well if you're really sort of focused on sort of really sort of specific stuff about how you're preparing. Just the day before, make sure you've got the simple stuff correct with enough sleep, have some food beforehand, maybe print off the details of where you're going, and bring a phone charger, things like that. I know some people have got quite worried about what they were wearing as well, and that becomes the most important thing to think about that morning. But I'm pretty sure that most interviewers, as long as it looks like you know you were coming to an interview, so you're wearing something that's maybe vaguely smart or smart casual, nobody's going to be assessing you as an interviewee based on whether you're wearing a suit, a shirt, or a mailing sort of top and trousers. Nobody's really thinking about that, so don't let yourself get consumed by it as well.
I definitely remember being very, very nervous. And when I look back on it now, I do think, in some ways, I just think, what was I doing? Like, I was 17. Like, what? It seems so wild when I look back on it now. And when I speak to school students who are so, so accomplished and they really want to go to medical school and they really want to be doctors. And I just think back on myself and I think, oh, and have no chance now, which I don't know if that's true or not. But, I think you have to give yourself some grace. No matter where you are, in your life, you've got to the point of having an interview for medical school. And that's a massive, massive achievement in and of itself because it's taken you a lot of hard work to get there. And this really is the sort of, the final hurdle towards your goals. And for the vast, vast majority of cases where you're unfortunately unsuccessful at interview, it's not because you're not good enough to be a doctor. It's because there is so many very talented, very highly qualified candidates that are being interviewed. And it doesn't mean that you're not going to be a doctor if you are unsuccessful at interview at that stage in your career.
There are probably going to be people listening who have had an interview and haven't received an offer, who will probably, be reapplying, might have an interview again. And I think it's really important to reflect on the fact that for many of us, our journey into, a medical career hasn't been this kind of straightforward pathway. Lots of people apply a couple of times. Like myself, I, did a degree before. I didn't know that I wanted to do medicine until I was in my 20s, and I actually applied 2 years running. And the first year I applied, I didn't get any interviews at all. And in my second year applying, I got one interview and one offer, and that was all that was needed. So I do think if somebody's done an interview and hasn't been successful, I think what you said, Anna, it's not a personal reflection. There's always things that you can take on board if you're going to go and do an interview again and again. Like, it's very competitive.
Firstly, getting into medicine is less competitive now than it has been because we've already increased the number of places in medical school quite substantially over the last 20 years, and it looks likely to increase again because as a country we need more doctors. That's the first point. Second one is, yes, interviews, the first thing is this person suitable? Could they make a good doctor? And there are really relatively few people invited to interview who would not make a good doctor. There are some who, astonishingly, there are some who are so obviously unsuitable you wonder about, how they got to that stage and why they applied in the first place, but it's only a minority. And the rest is very much having an evidential basis on which to rank people and to say, okay, the ones who's done best, and so we're going to make offers to, and the ones who didn't do that well, even though we think they would be perfectly suitable as a doctor and so on, we're not going to make an offer because we've only got a limited number that we can make. So what happens afterwards, after your interview, is worth saying something about. I mean, firstly, lots of medical schools, there's a great delay in actually even finding out what the outcome is. And that's often because they're doing interviews over many different days and they're only making their decisions after they've completed, some tens or even hundreds of interviews and so on. So don't let delay get you down. And then when you do get an outcome, you might get an offer. That's obviously, a positive outcome. You might also these days have them tell you that we'll put you on a reserve list. That's been quite a common thing over the last certainly 10 years, perhaps even longer than that. Or thirdly, they may simply say, I'm sorry, we're going to reject your application. In all of those cases, and so on, ask for some feedback. Some medical schools nowadays are very good at giving everybody some feedback on their interview. But I think particularly if you're only on a reserve list or you get rejected, try and find out what it is and so on. That you did well, because there will be some things you did well. Try and find out where are the kind of areas for development, where are the things that you didn't come across so well, because if medicine's the right thing for you and you want to reapply, why not find out and work on those things?
And I think you've also had the experience then, haven't you, of doing, you've gone through the interviews once. So I think drawing on that and seeing that as a positive thing.
I think a lot of people, and more people than you expect, have odd, silly, batty stories of getting into medicine. Not everybody thought about it for 10 years beforehand. Not everybody has both parents who are doctors or silly things like that. Like, most people have a unique and their own story of how they got into medicine. Lots of people do interviews a second time or a third time, and by no means is a failed interview any real reflection on you as potential suitability for a doctor. I think your suitability as a doctor is evidenced by your enthusiasm, your understanding of what it entails, and what you'd like to make of a career in medicine.
It's kind of talent and hard work, isn't it, Elgan? And actually, reapplying for a second time or possibly even a third time, is at least testimony to persistence.
I think one of the things I wanted to end on is, if you were to give somebody listening who has an interview later this year or is hoping to get an interview, what would be your single piece of advice you would give to them as people who've done this?
So I would say, genuinely and without a hint of cynicism or sarcasm in saying this, please be yourself, because the interviewers don't want to see the same thing. They don't want to hear the same answer from every single person. They want to hear what you think, what you have done, what your, reflections are on why you want to be a doctor. So please don't think that you need to go in and be someone completely different, because we need a huge range of people to be doctors in order for our workforce to work anyway. And that's what makes you you. So just lean into it.
We've discussed it a little bit, but I think it's really worth reiterating. The biggest hurdle I've seen people get tripped up at is sounding like a robot in their interview. And if you can avoid that, you're 90% of the way there. Put in some time to prepare and think about what you want to say in an interview, but don't rehearse your answers. And echoing what Anna's saying, try and be you, because an interviewer wants to be an imperfect you rather than a perfect robot.
And my tip would be clear and honest about the things that you're good at and the things that you need to work on. Because if you go into an interview confident about the things that you know that you can do well, and you can give evidence of those things, You may also well be asked about the things that you're not so good at or the things you're uncomfortable with. So be honest with yourself beforehand in preparation and so on, and be honest if you're asked about those things in an interview.
I think my advice would be to not worry if you feel like you're not like everybody else at the interviews, because I think I felt a little bit like that. I felt like, oh, like I'm like tattooed and like I feel like I don't look like what I imagine medical interviewers are going to want a medic to look like. And I really think taking that out of your brain and just knowing that you're there because you deserve to be there, you've got an interview, and not worrying about being the same as everybody else. I think that's really as simple
That's
as
nice
I
and
will
wholesome.
be.
That's excellent advice,
Yeah.
George. That's excellent advice.
So I think that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much to our panellists for joining us and to everyone at home for listening to this episode of Sharp Scratch. If you liked our show, I'd love it if you could support us by leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts or sharing it with the people you know. Tell your friends about it, that helps people to find us. Keep in touch, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the show, especially any trends you're finding interesting at the moment at med school. You can find us on social media, BMJ Student on Twitter and Instagram, and you can find Sharp Scratch on TikTok as well at Sharp Scratch Pod. Until then, it's goodbye from us.